Hey everybody, I'm Victor. I'm a PhD researcher with Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
And I'm Fabian, and we're going to be presenting to you a talk about stack unwinding. So specifically, we're going to be talking about control flow hijacking. Control flow hijacking means telling a program to execute stuff that it didn't do before, or it shouldn't have done the way it was written. So let's take a quick trip down memory lane where we have a stack of a function and a function calls another function. The return address of where execution will continue after that call goes on the stack. If we have a stack buffer overflow, we can overwrite it, and then we can make it go somewhere else. So that's classical stack buffer overflows. Another way, so this was addressed by adding a random cookie to the stack, and that cookie protects the return address. So if we overflow, the cookie gets changed and the program dies. Then another mitigation was added to that, where every return address goes onto a separate stack. So every time you have a return address on the real stack, it also goes onto a shadow stack. So these are shadow stacks, another mitigation against stack buffer overflows. Another popular exploitation technique on Windows was exploiting structured exception handling, where there is a linked list of pointers to exception handlers on the stack. And if you overflow those, you change them, you can control them, and you can hijack them that way. And this was mitigated by adding an allow list of allowed handlers. And with all of these mitigations, if our handler is not on the list, we die. So with all of these mitigations, stack buffers are a solved problem. That's our talk. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
I have a question for you.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Are there any exceptions to these mitigations?
That's good. Thanks for asking that. Yes. So now to what we will be talking to you about this time. We'll be talking to you about a technique that we call CHOP, or catch handler oriented programming. CHOP exploits the unwinder that handles exceptions in programming languages such as C++ or other compiled programming languages that do exception handling. And we confuse the unwinder. So, okay. Victor, in a nutshell, can you explain what the unwinder is?
So this unwinder is a piece of code. So as Fabian was telling you, in low-level, in programs written in low-level languages, when you get an exception, this unwinder kicks in and decides which exception handler will treat this exception. And with our technique that we call CHOP, we can exploit and hijack the unwinder to execute a different handler. Now, at the beginning of the talk, we saw that there are different control flow hijacking techniques, but there are defenses for them. Unfortunately, these defenses do not work on the unwinding path, which makes CHOP possible. We also have a paper coming out next week on this topic. So if you like the technique, if you like the talk, please read this paper as well. It's under embargo until the 10th of January. But you can find more information about this. You're going to see an icon. You see the icon in the right top corner. Every time you're going to see a slide with this, know that there's more on the topic in the paper. Now let's see the gist of what we're going to talk. We're going to start discussing a little bit on how the unwinder operates, to see what the problem with it is. Then, based on the problem, we're going to build with you the CHOP technique. We're going to show you how it works and how you can gain further control while pulling off this attack. Then we're going to show you more sophisticated ways or techniques that you can leverage this CHOP attack to pull off more stronger attacks, after which we're going to see the likelihood that this is indeed a serious issue by looking and analyzing popular binaries from Debian, after which we're going to conclude this talk with a real-world exploit of a bug with a known CV.
All right, so let's take a look at what this unwinder does under the hood. So looking at an piece of example code where we have one function with a try-catch block, and that calls another function. Again, the return address goes on the stack. So that's where execution would resume if an exception isn't thrown. However, in this case, our function bar throws an exception, and the unwinder is the piece of code that transfers execution from the throw statement to the corresponding catch block in a scope above on the stack. So it does that by looking at that return address and comparing it to an exception table. Within this exception table, we have call site ranges, which roughly correspond to the try blocks. Then there's some metadata about which types of exceptions are handled. And then finally, there's a landing pad, or the handler that gets invoked for this specific call site range, this specific set of exceptions, and then that's where execution continues. So let's look at an example to make this clear. Here we have 3 functions, or the stack for 3 functions, and the last function in that call chain throws in a bad alloc exception. So the unwinder will consult the exception handling table. It'll start out by looking at the return address of the first function, the one that threw the bad allocation exception. In this case, this return address is not in the table. So the stack unwinder will say, nope, I don't have a handler for this one. Let's continue unwinding. And then from there on, it'll look at the next stack frame. It'll look in there. It will find that there is a matching entry in there. But this is, so we threw a bad allocation exception, but there is an entry for a handler that handles a runtime error. So exception type doesn't match. We continue unwinding. And then lastly, we do find a matching return address and in the exception table in the corresponding call site range. In this case, the unwinder says, yes, we found one, and this is where execution will continue. So that's, in a few steps, basically what the unwinder does.
Okay.
So, and that brings us to how we can exploit this, because it uses those return addresses.
Okay, so coming back to this example, when this code will get compiled, the compiler will generate an entry in the table for this try-catch block. And when bar will throw, its return address will match the call site range of this catch handler, so it's going to execute this handler. But what happens if we overflow this return address and write something else there? Well, let's take a look at a simple example. Here we have a simple function call. The caller will catch the exception. The callee will throw the exception. Now, in normal execution, when nothing goes wrong, this execution will be caught by the according handler here in full. Now, if we overflow during the execution of function vul, and then we overflow the return address, and then throw the exception, and we overflow the return address with some address within the range of the cache handling bar, then we will trick the unwinder to execute this cache handler. But, OK, so what? So we redirect control. But these are valid handlers. So these are written by programmers, and programmers always write safe code, right? So you can't do anything with this without something else. So let's talk on what can we control when we redirect to a different handler. And let's use the same example. We have a caller that catches, callee throws. But the caller now also prints in the catch handler a variable on the caller stack frame, which is initialized to 23. Now, in normal execution, when this exception is caught, the caller will print 23. What happens if we overflow function vul? Let's show function vul here. And we redirect to a handler in a different function that does the same thing, prints a local variable. Well, you might think that, OK, it's going to print 42. Well, it's not going to print 42. It's still going to print. It's still going to print 23. Because even though we change the handler, we're still operating on the caller stack, which is function foo. So in other words, essentially, when you're going to overflow the frame past the return, you can control all local variables which are used by the handler during its execution. Now, you may say that, OK, then the chop technique requires you to overflow a return and then go past this return to control local variables, else you can't do anything. But it sort of happens that, for simplicity, some of these local variables are stored in call saved register during the caller execution. And when the caller will call the vulnerable function, it might spill some of these registers on the vulnerable function frame. When the unwinder kicks in, it knows that some of these registers are on the callie frame, and it's going to unwind these registers as well. So you might essentially have enough control just by overflowing the callie frame and reaching the return in order to take the unwinder.
Yeah. So with that, we basically saw that you can, by overflowing this return pointer, we can redirect to a different exception handler, and we can control the local variables of that specific exception handler. Let's take a look at how we can abuse this technique to craft some more interesting exploits. So again, we have a stack buffer overflow, then we reach a throw after that, and then finally, we execute a viable gadget or a handler that we can abuse. So let's take a look at what kind of handlers that we can abuse this way. So one of the most important things that we need to realize at this point is that the handlers and the throw statements don't necessarily need to be part of the code of the program that we're exploiting. For example, you could have a throw statement that's buried far in one library, and you could divert execution to a handler in a different library. So even if the program that we're exploiting doesn't do any exception handling, it might use libraries that do. And there is one library that is used a lot, and we found a really, really good handler in there. And this is part of the standard C++ library. And this is part of the code that terminates the program when no handler is found. And this, ironically, this part that terminates the program when there's no exception handler for an unhandled exception, that terminates the program on there, itself does exception handling. So there is a try-catch block in there. Not going to go into what happens in the try block. The important part for us is the catch block, because this catch block calls terminate with a pointer or a local variable. And as Victor explained to you just before, if we control the variables of that stack frame, because that comes from the stack, we can overwrite this pointer. And then it goes on and calls terminate and invokes that handler. And the other important thing about this is it's a catch-all block. So this means it matches all exception types. That's what the 3 little dots in that catch says. So this is a universal gadget. That's why we call it the golden gadget. Because if you can go on there, GG.
OK.
All right.
So another interesting technique where you can use the chop requires us to understand how stack protectors are applied. We talked a little bit about stack protectors at the beginning of the talk, but let's look a little bit, dive a little bit deeper. So this is the function path from LLVM that applies stack protectors to functions. Now, you may see here that before you insert a stack protector, you check if you actually need a stack protector. Now, let's see what happens in this require stack protector. It's a lot, this function has a lot of comments, so don't read it. I hope you don't see it through the TLDR. I'm going to tell you what this function does. So it checks if a function either explicitly calls a local, either defines 2 different programming constructs, a buffer on the stack, or has an instruction that uses the address of a local variable, normally known as the taken variables. If you don't have these prerequisites, a function will not get a stack protector. Now, what can we do with this information? Let's look at an example. So consider the call graph of a function that applies stack protectors. In the epilogue, you see the stack, the cookie check emitted by the compiler. if we overflow the return address, we also overflow the canary, so the function will abort. Now consider that this function also handles exceptions. We have a handler for it, and there's a throw that's been cut by this handler. Well, when the handler finishes its execution, it's going to flow in the epilogue of the function. So if during the execution of the handler, we want to overflow the stack even further to do a return-based control for hijacking, we cannot, because the cookie compare will stop us. But what if we have another handler in a function that doesn't have any alloca, doesn't have any buffer, no address taken local variables, and therefore no cookie? And we use a chop technique to redirect control to this handler, where in this scenario, if the handler gives us the possibility, we can further overflow the stack and do a technique that we call pivot to rope, in which we require initial return-based hijack to pull off the technique. And here we can actually do this because we don't have a cookie compare.
All right. So we just saw how we can evade the mitigation that we showed in the beginning. Are there any other ways we can exploit this? So let's look at a couple of functions, again, a called chain of 3 different functions. The first function, foo, has a try-catch block. It calls bar. Bar then called baz, and baz throws an exception. In this case, as we have seen a couple of times now, the unwinder will transfer control flow from the throw to the catch. Any code that is after baz, after the call to baz, will be unreachable. It will be skipped. There is an exception to this, though. If we have an object on the stack, and if that object has some kind of destructors that need to be called, so there's some cleanup code, that object's lifetime ends at the throw. So it will need to be cleaned up. The compiler will do this by emitting a cleanup handler for the cleanup code for the destructor that invokes this destructor. After that's done, execution will continue and continue to the next point in the unwinding chain, and it'll continue unwinding up to the catch handler. So in this case, the destructor will be run on the unwinding path. These cleanup handlers terminate not by returning, they terminate by calling a function called unwind resume, which then invokes the unwinder and tells it to continue unwinding. So if we overflow, we can't just go on to catch handlers, we can also target these cleanup handlers, and that gives us a couple of interesting primitives. So cleanup handlers have the interesting property that because they are destructors, they often call cleanup code. That means manipulating heap state. That means freeing variables. If we can target arbitrary frees, because the variables that get freed are local to the cleanup handlers, that means that we can also call arbitrary frees in the program. That's a really powerful primitive in exploitation because it allows us to trigger use after free vulnerabilities. You can also, because unwinding resumes after a cleanup handler, you can chain multiple cleanup handlers together, and then at the end of the cleanup handlers, return into a catch handler that terminates your chain. So you have multiple cleanup handlers, and then you return to a catch handler, and that's where you resume execution. So on the right here, you can see a reverse engineered cleanup handler from a binary. This is also lib standard C++. And that, in this case, has an arbitrary free gadget. So it calls the delete operator, which is free, and then it resumes unwinding. And you have a lot of those, as we'll see later on in the talk.
OK. So to understand other ways that we can trick the unwinder, let's look a little bit on how signal handling works. So when a process receives a signal, the operating system will stop this process. And it's going to decide to either kill the process or execute a signal handler. Now, what happens if we execute a signal handler? Well, before the signal handler executes, the operating system will create a special frame on the stack of the process. It's called a sig return frame. And it's going to point the return in this frame to something that resembles a special syscall called sig return. Now, after the signal, and in this frame, we have the state of the program just before doing the signal. So we have all general purpose registers here. After the signal finishes, the syscall sig return will restore all these registers from the signal from the sig return frame. However, when you execute a signal, you can also receive an exception. So because the exception happens before the syscall is called, the unwinder needs to essentially do the same thing while encountering a sig return frame. It needs to restore registers from this frame. However, the unwinder does not know that a signal actually happened. So it checks this return for a special opcode to see if this exception happened during signal handling. So an attacker can essentially overflow this frame, put a return that points to a sig return function, and override these registers, and then throw an exception. Now, this is essentially crafting a fake sig return frame. Now, the unwinder restores registers. One of the registers in this frame is the RSP, so the stack point. So when the unwinder will unwind this register, we have the possibility to pivot the stack to an attacker control location. Another register on this frame is the RIP. So you can essentially trick the unwinder to execute a different handler by crafting this fake sig return frame. You want to do a recap?
Yep. All right. So that was a lot. Let's look at the techniques that we just saw. So we started out by showing that we can divert control flow using a stack buffer overflow to a specific different handler. So this was a cleanup handler or a catch handler diversion. So invoking the wrong catch handler for that exception. The next thing we can abuse this way is, so for example, one example of that catch handler would be the golden gadget in libstandard C++, but we can also divert to catch handlers or handlers that don't have stack cookies enabled. So that allows us to pivot to ROP. Then we can chain cleanup handlers to groom the heap into a state where we can do use after free vulnerabilities and call arbitrary freeze. And then finally, with all of that, we can also craft sig return frames. And these sig return frames allow us to pivot the heap to other locations and control all registers as we unwind. So these are a couple of powerful primitives, but they need a couple of prerequisites. And with that, let's take a look at how easy it is to find those out there in the wild. Okay. Then Victor, let's take it away.
So let's talk a little bit on like some statistics on popular binaries. Now, first of all, let's recap on the technique. We need a stack buffer overflow to overflow a return address. We need a throw to trigger the unwinder, and then we need a viable handler. Now, stack buffer overflows are out there. The question is, do we have binaries that use exception handling that throw enough? Because if you don't have a throw, we cannot do a chop technique. And if we can do a chop technique, can we actually redirect to something that gives us like meaningful attacker-wise capabilities? And we essentially did a large-scale analysis on Debian packages. We used the Debian popularity contest to rank the top 1,000 most popular packages, and we extracted all binaries from these packages. This accounts to roughly 3,000 binaries, and then we did some analysis to check how many of these binaries use exception handling, either catch or throw. And roughly 10% of these binaries use exception handling, which is quite a large surface. But this doesn't tell us anything about our other prerequisites. So we did another analysis to check how many of these binaries and how many functions in these binaries will eventually throw. And we found out that half of these binaries contain at least 40% of functions that will eventually throw an exception. Now, this is quite a large surface for pulling off the initial chop technique, but what can we do with this? Now, if you noticed our previous 4 techniques that we presented, they all use more or less some primitive, some code gadget that gives the attacker further capabilities to exploit the program. So we kind of analyzed all these binaries to look for popular code gadgets. We extracted all catch and cleanup handlers from these binaries, and we searched for these specific gadgets. What we found out is that almost 80% of these binaries have at least one controllable free function that you can use to groom the heap with. Apart from that, around more than 50% of this binary contains at least one 4-dash control flow hijacking primitive, both in catch and cleanup code. And moreover, almost 50% of these binaries contain a fully controllable write primitive. This means that these primitives can be used both for control flow hijacking by overwriting a function pointer or corrupting the program state and do a data-only attack. So the attack surface is quite large. Popular binaries indeed contain primitives in these handlers.
All right. So we saw what the attack was, how the attack works. We saw that we have a lot of gadgets that are prevalent out there, and there's a lot of code that throws. Can we put these things together? Can we build real-world exploits with this technique? And we took a look at 3 pre-existing bugs in software that are out there. We didn't find these bugs. These were found by other people. But we looked at, are these exploitable with this technique? And to the best of our knowledge, they are all not exploitable when modern mitigations are enabled without our technique. So there was an overflow in Power DNS, which is a textbook example that is really nice to understand. There's Apple smart card services, and then finally there is an exploit in Libra, which is a nice piñata to poke at. And we're going to talk about our exploit in Libra. This is the vulnerable code that is in Libra when we exploited it. We're parsing EXIF tags in a raw image. Libra parses raw images and is used, for example, in ImageMagick. And we're looping over all of these different tags and taking that tag from the file. If the tag is a specific type of tag, in this case a maker node, then that gets handled specifically. So if it's a maker node for a Raspberry Pi image, from a Raspberry Pi camera and a specific type of Raspberry Pi camera, then the maker node is just plain text in the image. And Libra goes ahead and takes the length that is part of this EXIF tag and copies that much data into a static sized buffer on the stack. So MN text here is 512 bytes large. The attacker controls the length that gets copied into it. So we have a really, really classic stack buffer overflow in here. However, after that, we can't reach a throw. That's a problem. So we look at other, because we're looping around, we can then parse other EXIF tags, but there's no throw there to be found, except in one place. If our image is not a Raspberry Pi camera image, then we go into parse maker node down here. So we're in a bit of a pickle now. We can either have a Raspberry Pi camera image where we can overflow, or we can trigger a throw. Or can we? Let's take a closer look at the stack layout of these functions. Down here, we have the stack frame for parse maker node, and farther up on the stack is the make and the model of the camera. So if we overflow, we can change that make and model from a Raspberry Pi camera to, say, a Pwnberry Pi camera. And then in a subsequent EXIF tag, we can then invoke a throw. we'll set the return address to a gadget in libraw that allows us to pivot to a return-oriented programming chain. And we use a specific address that you can find in libstandard C++ or in libstandard C, or libc, where that allows, when you jump to that, it just spawns a shell for you. It's called the one gadgets. It's a popular exploitation technique. The handler that we're using is part of libraw, and it's, again, a catch-all handler that just returns 1. And the interesting part about this function is, again, it doesn't have any addresses taken. It doesn't have any buffers on there. It just returns 1. And if you look at this in a reverse engineering tool, you'll see that there is no compare of the cookie. There is no stack protector, so we can just pivot directly into Rob. And we have a small demo prepared for you over here, where we'll just show you what our exploit does. We're using a program called raw identify, which uses libraw to identify the specific camera or type that made an image. So we have an image made by a Raspberry Pi camera image, and it correctly says it's by a Raspberry Pi made this image. If we now run a script that crafts an exploit payload, it'll leak some pointers. In this case, we have ASLR disabled. We're assuming that there's another way to circumvent ASLR. Stands for a single leak required. So in this case, it only needs a single leak to find the base of the libraries and where they are in memory. After doing that, it builds together a payload that does the steps that we just explained on the stack, and it creates a new raw image with those EXIF tags in there. So there's first an EXIF tag that overflows the stack, and then there's an EXIF tag that then triggers an exception. So when we now run raw identify on pwn.raw, it'll spawn a shell for us, and we can use that shell to, for example, echo some messages. And yeah, that's our small demo. Similar things work in other in the other vulnerabilities, but we only have time to show you one of those, unfortunately. So with that, we're approaching the end of our talk. So again, as we saw here, even though we have 2 different code paths that are disjunct, that we can do either one of the both. In the case where we can do a stack buffer overflow and modify that stack, we can actually trigger both this else, this branch, and this else branch. And the key takeaway here is that if we control the stack, we can make the program do things that aren't obviously visible just by looking at the source code. And you can reach throws that aren't obviously reachable as well. With that, we're approaching the end of our talk. We looked at how unwinding works and figured out and saw how the unwinder uses return addresses to figure out where to target the exception handlers. If we overflow those return addresses, we can do catch handler oriented programming. And that's the general idea of our talk, of what we're presenting today. We talked about 4 different specific techniques that you can use to leverage CHOP, either by using the golden gadget in libstandard C++, by pivoting to a return-oriented programming and evading stack cookies. We looked at the signal handlers. And then finally, we also looked at the cleanup handlers and how you can chain them to manipulate the heap into a state that's good for exploitation and trigger use after freeze. And then after stats and the real world example, now we're here at the end of our talk recapping what we did. There's a couple of honorable mentions and people that helped us along the way. I think it wasn't just us 2, it was an entire research team that you saw in the beginning of the slide.
We also like to thank the CTF team Tasteless for organizing a CTF on this subject.
Yeah. Greg, super helpful. He pointed out an example that was a textbook example, the power DNS bug, which is really nice at demonstrating this topic. Yiska for the cookie monsters that were hiding in the slides. And Yeah.
They are my team, the FUSEC group, that gave us a lot of feedback and drilled us many times for this presentation. And I hope you people enjoyed it. It was really fun to do this. And with this, we're going to leave on this slide a couple of key takeaways from our talk.
I think, given the time, do we have time for questions? We do.
We do have time for questions.
Or do we? I think maybe one quick question.
If anyone has any questions, they should come up to the mic.
Yeah, just come up to the mic. We'll leave these up here. There's also a QR code with a GitHub repository that's currently empty. It'll be filled as soon as the...
You heard these promises before.
Yeah, it'll be filled as soon as the embargo lifts.